life experience, bringing professional experience, bringing their business experience to this. And I'm going to give a framework that is coming out of the work that we're doing in the Key Center that's looking at these issues from this lens of spatial structural racism. There are parts of this, and I'll call them out, that I view as hypotheses. Right? And I would really welcome your input, right? During the discussion, even afterwards, if you want to shoot me an email saying, that's all wrong, right? That's not like my neighborhood, or you're right on track, right? We'll give me the examples or details, and you'll see what I mean when I get there. But my sense is you can't think about any issue in Detroit if you're not willing to think in terms of spatial and structural racism. What we see here, in 2013, I was really proud to be part of a team that put together Judge Keith's biography. And I like to call him out to say that I got the toughest job in Detroit, which is trying to live up to the life and legacy of Judge Keith, right? But that same year, I put out another book called Change and Continuity at the World Bank, Reforming Paradoxes of Economic Development. And that book has about 10 years of work really thinking about, from an international perspective, why we keep trying the same thing for 70 years and it doesn't work, and we don't learn, and we keep repeating it. Right? And in many respects, that book set the framework for the work I've done from an economic perspective, development perspective in Detroit. Right? You sort of carry on to think about a traditional economic development series humanistically. But next slide. I always like to tell people what I'm going to do, and I'll do it, and I'll tell you what I've done. But the entire presentation is really in this one slide. Right? Spatial structural racism lies at the heart of Detroit's economic challenges, racial inequality, and endemic poverty. Right? And if you don't start with that premise, you're starting with the wrong diagnosis. Traditional economic models and economic strategies can often compound rather than redress racial inequality. Right? So we're just taking what we've done before and doing more of it. I can almost guarantee you we're producing more inequality as opposed to reducing inequality. What you are here today, from what I understand, is really asking about how to lay new foundations to take meaningful economic action in Detroit's neighborhoods. Right? Very important question, critical to the entire future of the city and the lives of its inhabitants. But if you are really going to answer that question, you have to challenge yourself to come to new strategies, new approaches, and new tactics. Right? And if you don't, you're not doing the work you need to do, and if you don't, you're not serving the needs of the city. So next slide, please. Think about what determines where people live, right? And think about that from a 70-year, 80-year, 100-year perspective. Right? And I try to give people mantras to try to take them and apply to your own lives. Think about the racialization of space and the spatialization of race. Right? The racialization of space, the spatialization of race. Think about how it affects the neighborhood you're working in. Think about how it affects how you drive through the city. Think about how it affects how you're driving through the region. I also want you to think about, again, the 70-year time frame. What has happened in that 70 years, we've taken segregated space that existed inside the city of Detroit and reproduced it at a level of the region where we now have entire cities serving as the segregated spaces. Right? So it's still there, it's taking a new form. We've got to start thinking about the dynamic reproduction of racialized hierarchies. And we can't think about that if we don't think about the region. And I haven't heard anybody talk about regionalism. Right? If you're an economist, in theory, and I'm going to challenge this theory, in theory we're all part of a regional economy. Right? But we're not talking about the region. And I'm going to challenge that notion we actually have a regional economy. Next slide. Some people have seen this before, and I'm going to go through it quickly. I'm going to make these slides available. Anybody wants to email me, or I think it's part of different packages. So all of this is open source, right? So anybody that's interested can get it. We're going to do an opportunity map, right? So think about what opportunity is. Value of housing, employment, schools, health, transportation, food security, living environment, right? Think about where there's opportunity in the region, right? And in your mind's eye, in your own life experience, start painting in that map of opportunity in the region, and think about areas of high opportunity, and start painting in those areas of high opportunity in dark, rich colors. Right? Think about areas of low opportunity, and I want you to paint those areas of low opportunity in light, pale colors. I'm going through this quick, so I apologize, but I promised 20 minutes so we have discussion. This is a map produced by the Kerwin Institute of Ohio State, the next slide, of opportunity in the region. What's this? Pontiac, so everybody can situate the map. You can see Pontiac from outer space as an opportunity district. Right? Go a little bit lower and over, what do we see? Detroit. Right? That must mean there's no opportunity in Wayne County. No, look at the Grosse Pointes. Right? Look at some other areas. Right? But what we see here very clearly is a very stark segregation of wealth and opportunity at a regional level. Right? Then think about racial demography. And the next map is in black and white, and I always apologize because there's more diversity in this room than just black and white. But for teaching purposes, it's pretty dramatic and pretty effective. So you're going to see a series of green dots, and they're going to represent predominant African American communities by census tract. And this is what the map looks like when we add demography. Next slide. Toggle back and forth a few times so people can kind of see that. The association now, not just of a segregation of wealth and opportunity, but a segregation of race, wealth, and opportunity. And that's what John Powell and others call spatial racism. Right? And I think it's critically important we use these words, right? That we not hide from these words. We are living in ground zero in the United States of spatial racism. I tell my own students, we are the new Selma, right? And if we're not acting with the intentionality of being the new Selma and making that impact your work, you're missing that opportunity, and we should all be judged historically for what we do and what we don't do in this context. Go back one slide, please. Right? Think about all of these pale areas. Right? In theory, we have a regional metropolitan statistical area. Right? And in theory, that's the entire region on this map. I'm going to give you a different interpretation. Look at all of those pale light colors. Right? That's not just the absence of opportunity, that's the absence of economic markets. Right? And now think how profound that is if you start thinking about the presence and absence of economic markets. Right? All of those dark rich areas, that is the standard metropolitan statistical area. That is the regional market. Right? What that means is you see disconnects. Neighborhoods, and we're going to turn to that in a minute, are not part of the regional economy. And if you're thinking as an economist, if you're thinking as a policymaker, if you're thinking as an advocate and not building your analysis around that, you're in a dreamland. Right? So how are you going to get economic development in the market until you get an assessment to really understand whether or not there are markets in there to develop and which markets are present and which markets are not? Go 2 slides forward, please. So what are the implications? Right? Deep breath. Right? Take a bite of food. Right? This is some of the things that fall out of trying to reinterpret that map and apply it. We live in a dysfunctional, 2-tiered regional economy, separate and unequal. Right? That is the fact. That's the reality. I'm saying that as an economist, not just as a civil rights advocate. We are segregated economically and racially. Right? That means that the neighborhoods in this interpretation are not part of the same economy. Not saying there's no economy there, but it's not part of the regional economy, and that's incredibly important. If that's the case, and if we take standard economic models of development and apply them, they will not work. Right? Remember the book, Changing Continuity of the World Bank. Why are we doing the same thing for 70 years, not learning about it? Right? We've done that in Detroit, and that's going to be my last slide, and it's going to be an homage to Professor Drew Manning Thomas. Downtown Detroit is connected to the regional economy. Right? And indeed, you can look at economic development in Detroit in the last 6 years, and you can see the only parts of Detroit that the region cares about. Right? And if you don't understand the connection between those two things, you don't understand the economics of development. What that means, if I'm pouring money into the parts that are connected to the region, where is the benefit redounding to? The region. Right? That means if you take this interpretation about the absence of markets, there never will be trickle down. There never will be spillover effect. And if we don't plan that in the beginning and we just repeat the mistakes, we're going to have the same outcomes. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? Right? We just start thinking about where you work, thinking about the neighborhoods. And this is why I say I want your input. Right? Is this true? This is my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that the neighborhoods are largely defined by the absence of markets. Right? But I'm in my ivory tower at Wayne State. Right? You are living out there. Right? So you could, on either side of this, give me incredibly valuable information. I invite you to do that. Email me, write me, call me, and tell me what you think in terms of your work about whether this is true. Right? But my assessment is there's no job market in these neighborhoods. Right? There's no supermarkets in these neighborhoods. We've talked about food deserts for a long time. There's no meaningful mortgage markets. There's no credit market. There's no housing market. There's no auto insurance market. There's no market for public or private transportation. Right? So the real development challenge is understood by this is how do you build those markets when you don't have those markets? Right? And I haven't seen any of the national historical economic development literature for urban areas that frames it like this or really takes on that as the primary challenge. Next slide, please. Again, implications. What does this mean if you take this seriously, and what does it mean if this is actually true? First off, we have narrow development. right? And we can draw a map of the 7.2 miles. You can do a heat map about where investment has gone in the last 6 years, and that will tell you where the markets are, right? Because development goes to the markets. It doesn't go to the market's farms, right? More importantly, and this is where the impact on historical residents, we've not only had very narrow development, we've had very broad displacement. And I scanned the literature, which you handed out this morning. I don't see displacement prioritized as importantly as it should be. Right? We've had displacement by water shutoffs, we've had displacement by tax foreclosures, we've had displacement by increasing rents, we've had displacement by gentrification. Right? And if we can't think about development without displacement, right, we're not thinking about meaningful forms of economic development that are going to benefit the actual people who live in the neighborhood. So next slide, please. And this is something that we've been testing out. Because again, I put in the realm of hypothesis, right? It's something that I've come to believe, and it's something that we're trying to organize our own activities at the Key Center around. That if we're really living in a world defined by abandonment, we really need self-help. What do the people actually need? Right? They need their basics. They need water when they turn on the faucet. They need to stay in their home. They need food. They need basic education. Right? And if that's not being provided by the market, and if that's not being provided by the government, they've got to find ways to provide that themselves. Right? And I've said this in a number of different settings, and I'll say it here, and I believe it. If you want economic advice for the neighborhoods now, if you believe self-help really is important, then you need to look to the Black Panthers and not the Chamber of Commerce. And this is trying to be as real and apply these things from what I understand in terms of theory to what's actually out there. And I would challenge each of you, if you're a community development council or corporation, how can you enable forms of self-help? Right? How can you be part of that solution? That's not a permanent solution, right? That's out of humanitarian necessity, meeting people's immediate needs, right? We need a second track. Right? How do we start to integrate ourselves both politically and economically, not to existing economic markets, but into new economic markets that are predicated upon the values of equity, right, of fairness. And we have examples of that, right? We can't imagine inclusive development, not if we do what we did in the past, but what we've already started to do in Detroit and project that beyond 8 Mile and change the region, not just change Detroit. We are the first city in the country to have a community benefits ordinance, one that is in need of serious amendment and repair, but a baby step in the right direction. So, the predicate of the analysis here, first self-help, right? Then try to think about the policies that would constitute equitable development that we can project regionally, right? And then how does that merge? Right? Because if you're doing self-help right, and this again is lessons that you're able to get historically, you're building not just economic citizens, you're building political citizens. Right? You're doing so in a way that's inculcating values, that's producing a political consciousness, that ultimately will produce the political power that's necessary to get the policy change that we've been talking about today, but policy change in terms of what our values of racial equity and racial inclusion actually look like. Right? So we've got to be intentional, we've got to link these two things and imagine how these two things are ultimately going to be coming together. So next slide, I'm going to just give 2 examples of where this new thinking could lead. Right? And this is very preliminary. This is where you have all these smart people in the room can start thinking and helping and adding to the kind of analysis that we're trying to build. First, if you study economics, even at the undergraduate level, we were pretty quickly introduced to this notion of the capital-labor ratio. Right? And that sounds complicated and intimidating, but like all economics, it's really a tautology. Right? It says if capital is expensive, use more labor. Right? If labor is cheaper, use more labor, and if labor is expensive, use more capital. Right? And so every economy, depending upon the relative cost of labor and capital, gets its capital-labor ratio, and that guides a whole series of economic investments. What do we know about Detroit? Right? We have relatively accessible labor. Okay? So that means we shouldn't do it, with all due respect to Cleveland and Boston and all of these other cities necessarily. We shouldn't just reproduce what they're doing. Right? We should make sure that every investment, every program that we're doing translated at the neighborhood level to a means that is going to adopt a new capital-labor ratio, which is going to accentuate the role that we're having in terms of using more labor, less capital. Right? Think about what that means for blight removal. Right? What do? We bring in the biggest bulldozer, right? We bring in the fewest number of people, and we knock down the house as quick as we can, often with some unintended environmental consequences. Who benefits from that? Who owns the capital? So where's the money going when I pour it into the city under that capital labor ratio? It's not staying in the neighborhoods. If I were to imagine blight removal as a jobs bill, right, and to be using people in the neighborhoods to be actually effectuating this, I would have a different capital labor ratio. I would be creating labor, right? And whether it's less slower. Well, that means job security for a while, right? So if we change our time horizon, we can actually view that as a benefit, not as a disadvantage. And I say that we've got to be intentional. It's not just a job. If we really take this seriously, we have to layer over job preparedness. We have to view this as a stepping stone for these people who come back into the economy, who are not part of the economy, get the skills that they need to be going on to further work, not doing this their whole lives, but rather a stepping stone, and now start to merging these economies that don't exist in markets that don't exist by creating people with the skills that have to be real economic citizens and political citizens. Right? We could do that for municipal services. You know, shouldn't we have people in city council and the executive saying, how am I spending municipal dollars, right? Can I reconfigure the capital labor ratio, and now can municipal services be provided differently in ways that create more labor opportunities? Green infrastructure is going to be more important, especially when you got water management. If I were to do that in a way, and those are really scalable downwards, so there's really economic logic as well, what would that look like in the neighborhoods, right? And equally important, not just the people working there, I could be getting new businesses that are going to be sponsoring those people and getting people that have the business skills and the contracting skills to be having the ability to participate meaningfully in an economy that they're now excluded to. Next slide. Another just example, think about housing. Right? A lot of you have done more housing work than I, so I say I welcome input, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. But if I do my diagnosis that we're building here, first thing I recognize, there's no commercial mortgage market. Now when I have any program in the land bank that says only credit-worthy people can apply, I am now using code language to exclude most of historic Detroit residents, right? Because there isn't a market. Right? What I then have is a spiral that's giving me increasing rents, right? Fewer homeowners, and less affordable housing. Right? How does that possibly make sense as a successful economic model of development? Right? And again, these are preliminary ideas, but ones that we should be taking seriously to at least explore. If we don't have money, but we have public ownership of land, why doesn't the land bank give land contracts? Right? Pretty basic intuitive question that would then say I don't have to go to the non-existent credit market. I can deal with historic residents. I can build all sorts of things about credit literacy and qualifications and life improvements into that, and I can solve affordable housing with the biggest asset I have in the city, which is land owned by the public. So anyway, that just had to be started in different ways. If we need to rehab housing, what's the capital labor ratio we should use to rehab housing? And why don't we use that as a jobs bill? Why don't we use that as a training mechanism for returning citizens and people who are looking for that kind of meaningful work? So if we can start connecting these dots by looking at the resources we do have, but looking at the economic situation through an appropriate lens, right, we have all sorts of opportunities. Right? If I take what is happening outside the region and try to reproduce it in these markets, I'm going to have like taking an exotic plant. Right? Planting it is going to die. Right? And this is an opportunity. I really believe that there's a real opportunity here to think in new ways. And I'm winding down to make it open for discussion. The next slide. We advance one. All right. So what do we learn if we learn from lessons abroad? I'm going to go through these quick, so get ready to advance. I want to end this. If you look in the United States, and this is my opinion, right, there has been really no creative thinking about economic development or urban renewal since the early 1960s. Right. Just wipe that all out. Right? Now, when you had Reagan and Thatcher adopt sort of fiscal austerity in the United States, there has been no pushback. When that happened internationally, people were out in the streets. Countries would not accept that. And so if you're looking for where there has been interesting theory about economic development, it's not in the United States, it's abroad. And these are some quick lessons you can learn if you look abroad. So next slide. One of the best ways to get growth, invest in people. Right? And not in a narrow human capital way, but in a full holistic notion of a life cycle of learning to develop all of human capabilities. Right? Great economic theory that gets you growth. Next slide, please. Right? If you have political and economic inclusion, you get growth. Right? So we have to build not only economic citizens, but political citizens. And I've seen that in some of the work that's coming out of here, but not necessarily as directly focused. That gets you growth, right? So it's not just looking at the economic side, look at the entire political side, look at the person holistically, and if you do that, you'll actually get better growth. Last lesson that we get internationally is that if we decrease income inequality, we get growth. Right? So reducing income inequality is a growth strategy, and one with direct implications for Detroit, direct implications for the region. 2 more slides. Last one, as I said before, we've been here before. Right? Look at June Manning Thomas's book about race and redevelopment in Detroit. Almost every time we've said we're going to develop Detroit, we have done so in a way that has exacerbated racial inequity. Right? We are on a new point. Right? We can either take that lesson and see that reproduction of systems of racial hierarchy and oppression, or we're going to try to start breaking out of it. And none of this is easy, so I don't want to kind of create an illusion that there's sort of a new idea that sparks it. This is hard stuff, right? But if there's anything I've learned about Detroiters, that you are used to hard work, right? And if anybody knows that's doing community work, you are the instructors and experts in hard work. Right? But know our history, because we're about to repeat it if we're not conscious. And last slide, I'm going to leave just sort of tantalize you, not explain it dramatically, and if you want it later, you can kind of get me down, and then I'll talk about it. There's a notion called cargo cults, right? And I'll explain that there. You can Google it, those that have your devices working. My claim is that traditional economic models of development are like cargo cults, right? And the cargo cults got created in the South Pacific Islands during World War II, where the Army came in and built all of these airstrips, right, and bases for the war, and then they disappeared, right? But when they were there, they had all sorts of cargo, all sorts of good things that the indigenous people had never seen before. And when anthropologists came decades later, they would find the native communities making bamboo airplanes, worshiping the bamboo airplanes on the hope that it would bring the cargo back, right? And we see all those silly native people, right? Think about our stadiums today. Right? Somebody was already seeing where it's going. We build stadiums, we worship stadiums, and believe that that brings the cargo. Right? And we have to come to a new economic moment that says, in a world surrounded by spatial structural racism, where we're at ground zero, we are also in a cargo cult. Right? So we've got to break out of those traditional ways of thinking, challenge our ways to think new, and imagine trying to actually build neighborhoods as economic and political citizens. So that's my quick point.
So he really packed a lot into that PowerPoint presentation, didn't he? So we have a few minutes that we want to open it up for some conversation here, some questions. For Peter, is there anything in particular, thinking about the hat that you're wearing today and looking ahead, that resonated with you about his comments? Oh, and stand up and yes, speak louder.
And that's by design, right? So the downtown development authority accepts all of the development dollars that are generated downtown from there. Is it possible for us to redesign those systems also so that those dollars can spill over to some of the utility policy at the state and city level?
So it's great to take existing forms and play with them. Right? And one could imagine kind of virtually saying, I'm going to connect this neighborhood to this part of the downtown development zone, and that's one mechanism to weaken the link where all the money stays downtown. Right? And I would say that's a good thing, right? But it's incredibly incomplete. Right? A great big step. In part because it starts to break down the way we think, right? And changing the way that we think is actually one of the most important things we can do to change what we want to be doing in our work. But it's by design, not just by the policies, which I love the way that you sort of pull that out, but by the fact that that's only where the market is. So even if there was no limitation on the tax dollars coming out, there is no economic logic, right, given that that's the only place that's connected to the region, that's the only place that the economic markets are, so it's even deeper than that. So great one idea, right, challenges our thinking, but we really have to think about the absence of market, the presence of markets, and where those lines are and how important they are in defining how much traditional economic thinking is going to help and how much traditional economic thinking will not help.
I'm just thinking that even I agree with you that it's incomplete, and I agree with all the rest of your organizations, all of them.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking that, you know, protecting the entertainment tax, the tax utilization of those downtown amenities that taxpayers are paid for would be one way to make sure the neighborhoods benefit when people are using those amenities paid for.
Yeah. No, and there's just another, you have to start thinking about change in an evolutionary fashion, right? So one of the best things about the fight over community benefits is to educate the community about what community benefits are, and let them think about what they're entitled to as a matter of citizenship. So I could imagine if we took a fight over the definition of the downtown development area, and made the argument politically, working even with the existing sort of political and economic paradigm, and try to connect it to the neighborhood, that's a huge educational opportunity, right? And having that victory is the kind of victory that we're thinking about sequentially to be building that political and economic consciousness that would then enable us to broaden the scope of the change that we could imagine, right? So there's a lot of ways where we're tactically choosing the fight strategically, and that's a very good fight that shows all sorts of important interconnections, could lead to other victories.
Okay, yes, question.
Given your concentration on self-care, self-help, and we're talking about Boston, and I know the gentleman talked about how Berkshire County, right, is really very much of the community development. We know that they're also have their own dollars, one of the largest community land trusts right in the country. How did that fit into your analysis? You understand about changing the economic system?
Yeah, there are urban areas that are better integrated into the regional economy. Right? And there, you talk about, hedges against recession, you talk about opportunities for growth, you talk about closeness of job markets. Their economic development issues are easier. Right? And I don't want to minimize the challenges that people in Cleveland and Boston fight, because you get down to the micro level, you're still going to find the absence of markets. Right? So it's a scale question, it's not the existence question. The challenge here is we're about 2 or 3 standard deviations beyond what most of these challenged cities are facing. Right? And for whatever reason, historically, and that's another different talk, we have built racism into our region. Right? And until we kind of see that and understand this reality, it's very hard to dismantle it. Right? And so I think the degree of separation that's built in is so much stronger here. And I don't want to put it all in the neighborhoods of responsibility, right? This is a state responsibility. This is a regional responsibility. We need to be working at all sorts of different levels. And we can't just sort of say, well, sorry neighborhood, it's only you, right? But I am saying we've got to take an accurate diagnosis of the neighborhood. We've got to think about policy changes at many different levels. But if we're not dealing with self-help in the neighborhood, which is really addressing people's immediate needs, we are being incredibly irresponsible. Because that other change takes more time. And just to be honest, that other change, we don't have the political power to do it. Right? So while we're waiting to build the power, we also have to be helping to meet the needs of the citizens.
All right, I saw another hand. Yes, and then you. Please stand up, go.
Controversial question, but medical marijuana, recreational marijuana is here. And when we look at region versus the inner city and our outlying neighborhoods of Detroit, we're from Northeast Detroit, so we've got 8 Mile as our main line corridor. And some people see marijuana as the new green that will bring prosperity to the neighborhoods. On the other hand, some see the investors coming from West Bloomfield and the affluent areas just taking advantage of our neighborhoods. How do you view this marijuana question in terms of what you just showed us?
And I always operate in worlds that I know well and don't, and I haven't really done a lot of analysis of that, so I don't want to get strong opinions, so I get impressions. My first impression is if you don't intervene, things reproduce themselves. Right? So in the absence of some conscious intervention about how that takes place, who is enabled to participate, who benefits, my first intuition is that a lot of money will come in because we're viewed as an abandoned territory and that myth is there. And so we're also ripe for exploitation. Right? Not saying that it couldn't be done differently, but if we're not intentional, my sense is that it won't be. My bigger fear is that things like U.S. ecology, right, come along. Or that whole tradition we've had of environmental racism in the city, and that the neighborhoods will be viewed as economic opportunities for dumping waste, right? And that's the kind of economic development that the neighborhood deserves. But I think they're interlinked, right? Unless we kind of put higher standards on what we demand, right? I think that's one of the things that community benefits is raising consciousness to do. And unless we're actually trying to tie the development to the folks who are living in the area and being responsive to their needs. There's a very strong kind of participatory element. If we don't have good processes that are intentional about seeking racial equity, we don't get racial equity, right? Because in this country, you're trying to fight gravity, because all the other forces are pushing in the opposite directions.
Okay, so I have a question here, and then we'll take one from this side of the room. Please stand up. Thanks.
I wanted to ask about neighborhood enterprise development and their uses in regards to proposed listing government.
Yeah, and this is why I say a lot more knowledge about some of the details, and I always try to not overclaim what I can say things on. My first intuition is you strategically use whatever tools you have, right? And that's again sort of survival techniques, right? So if there's a tool there that enables you to do what you want, do it, right? But always have kind of multiple time horizons in place, right? And also again think strategically. If you're operating within the sort of existing structure in a way that's useful to you, how do you leverage that into a stepping stone to take you to the next place you want to be? Right? Because changing it doesn't happen overnight, right? At least in my approach to change. Other people have different theories of change. But it's a very intentional process that is trying to say, I do what I can control first, right? Because I can't do what I can't control. I then try to enable and create the kinds of power and awareness and economic and political citizenship within those bounds. And I'm always trying to imagine what's the next step. What's the next step? Right? And commit ourselves, right? This is not going to be an easy fight, it's not going to be a short fight, but we have to be strategic. But you can't be strategic if you don't understand how the system works, so I really applaud all the kind of system thinking that's been talked about. That's the kind of thinking we need if we're going to try to think about self-help leading to a strategy of changing the nature of the economy. And we have to think about taking steps, right? Not sort of hurrying to where we want to go, but rather think about these kind of strategic steps we can take and realize that if you're not bringing the neighborhood citizens with you, you're not going anywhere. Right? So not detaching yourself from the notion of really being guided by, in a participatory sense, and working with the folks that we allegedly are saying we want to help.
Phyllis.
Yes, Peter, thank you. I'm just, you're my Christmas present. You talked about creating markets where there are no markets, and that we have to think outside of the United States to look for those answers. If we were to begin that journey, where would you suggest we start? What country, what community could we look at, or what book could we read to really start? I'm interested in that.
Yeah, and surprisingly, well, maybe not surprising, not a lot of people have really written about that, right? So I keep trying to see who's going to do that, right? But there's an interesting difference between about the sort of long sweep of economic development. And it is kind of magical what took place in the West, right? If you look historically, all trade and all economics are based upon personal relationships, right? And are governed by the scope of personal relationships. If you build enough institutions, legal institutions, economic institutions, you're able to do something pretty amazing, which is to get trade between strangers. Right? And we live in an economy, better or for worse, that enables trade between strangers. Right? My sense, these are again intuitions, that's why I sort of put this as a hypothesis, to make this a collective exercise and say that people in this room have much more to add than I do. I can maybe stimulate the thinking, but it's sort of a collaborative process to answer questions like that, is that we're in a realm of the neighborhood where one of our biggest assets is building relationships. Right? And then out of relationships become opportunities to engage in, and I'm not thinking about just all things in trade sense and transactional or things that would normally go to a market. But there's a notion of time banking. And it's hard to do and it doesn't often work. And informal economies, those are very logically layered into this notion of saying, well, I can help you with this and you can help me with that. Right? And I can structure it in a way where we can kind of have 3-way, 4-way, 5-way trades. Right? That's very consistent with it. It's also consistent, I mean that sort of really taking seriously the kind of social services that the Black Panthers and other organizations historically have provided, is saying we also have to help each other that can't trade. Right? And it's not only based upon trade, it's really trying to, again, be dealing with the